Welcome to the Quality During Design podcast. I'm your host, Diana Dini. I want to get you to your episodes soon, but first I have an announcement and an opportunity for you. I'm excited to bring you a brand new learning opportunity about FMEA, Failure Mode and Effects Analysis. It's a course titled FMEA in Practice, From Plan to Risk-Based Decision Making. This course takes you beyond standards and how to fill in a table. I created this course to help you practically use an FMEA that integrates with risk management to drive improvements and for your success. I've collaborated with the Manufacturing Academy to bring you this course. The Manufacturing Academy has a catalog of courses through the Udemy course platform. Udemy is used worldwide by adult learners, and when you sign up for this course, you get lifetime access and a certificate of completion when done. You also have Q&A access to multiple course instructors, including myself, through the Udemy platform. Discover more about everything this course has to offer by using the link in the show notes of this episode or on the Quality During Design website. Again, it's titled FMEA in Practice, From Plan to Risk-Based Decision Making. Since you're a valued listener to this podcast, I want to offer you a special promotion. For a limited time, you can sign up for this course for only $12.99 US. That's $12.99. When you sign up for this course on Udemy, enter coupon code FMEA24. This coupon is only good for a limited time, so use it while you can. Again, the coupon code is FMEA24. Join me. Enroll now and take the first step towards mastering FMEA and transforming your risks into strategic insights. Sign up today. When we're designing something, whether it's a product, a manufacturing process, or even a service, we are thinking about the bad things that could happen, the risks, and we try to design those out of whatever it is that we're developing. Part of designing it out, of course, is identifying what they are, and we're going to have to make some trade-off decisions, so there's going to be some prioritization going on. A typical way that we do this in development is with a failure mode effects analysis. It's traditionally a reliability engineering tool, but it can be used by a team of people to identify those potential risks, those potential bad things that could happen that we want to reduce, eliminate, or otherwise control. Traditional methods include rating scales on a scale from 1 to 10, for example, and they could also include things like risk matrices or risk indices, where we are mapping out our risks on a matrix that has traffic light symbols, green, yellow, and red. There are a lot of criticisms and critiques with these traditional methods, and they're not wrong. Let's talk more about it after this brief introduction. Hello, and welcome to Quality During Design, the place to use quality thinking to create products others love for less. I'm your host, Diana Dini. I'm a senior-level quality professional and engineer with over 20 years of experience in manufacturing and design. I consult with businesses and coach individuals in how to apply quality during design to their processes. Listen in and then join us. Visit qualityduringdesign.com. I'm happy to share that I recently checked something off my bucket list, which was a course about FMEA. I've done a lot of FMEA in my career. I stemmed from the medical device manufacturing industry where it's required. I was heavily involved in creating these for teams, so I learned best practices and I learned what not to do. I took my best practices and the things that weren't so good, and I conglomerated it into a course for you on Udemy. At the time that this podcast airs, it will have been out for a little while, and you may have seen something about it already. I hope so. If not, please check it out. I really did create it to help people navigate and get the most out of FMEA that they could. I did base it off of my experiences, but I also looked outward into what other people were doing and saying about FMEA and risk management in general. In my social feeds and in the blogs that I read, I routinely come across posts about risk matrices and how bad they are and how we need to stop using them. Now, a risk matrix is a 2x2 matrix, which is severity occurrence, and we map out severity and occurrence within the matrix, and it's filled with boxes of green, yellow, and red. Green meaning, hey, this is great. Yellow is caution, and red is beware. If you work in the automotive industry, you may be using their latest standard, which uses an action priority number, which is mapped out in a matrix, but it considers 3 different things: severity, occurrence, and detection, and has the same tricolors associated with it. Generally, there is a lot of risk index hate going on out there, and it's not unfounded. I wanted to explore these critiques and incorporate them into the FMEA course that I offered. So I created a lecture that focused on the criticisms of these traditional methods that we use, which is the ordinal scales for rating scales, the risk indexes, and some of the other summary priority numbers that FMEA traditionally has used. I put on my reporter hat and I did a little bit of digging and came up with some pretty good resources. In this episode, I want to share with you that one lecture that I included in the FMEA course. I talk about what the criticisms are, the things that we need to watch for, why it's considered a problem. And I do it in a place of what we can do instead. Please take a listen to this lecture, and I will see you on the other side of it with some of my wrap-up thoughts. Traditional FMEA rating criteria and prioritization were transplanted into other areas of the business, where now we have a larger pool of diverse people using similar methods. There are criticisms to the way we've always done things. Let's review what these criticisms are so we can make our FMEA process more robust. Using ordinal rating scales introduces many errors in risk analysis. And ordinal rating scales are what are traditionally used in FMEA. Some practitioners call them subjective weighted scores with arbitrary point values based on categories. And when they're described that way, it does sound less than ideal. Let's take a closer look at why using ordinal rating scales can introduce errors. Douglas W. Hubbard authors How to Measure Anything, and he says, scores, in this case rating scales, are methods of attempting to express relative worth, preference, and so on without employing a real unit of measure. It introduces additional errors. So what kind of errors are introduced by using traditional rating scales or these ordinal rating scales? There can be several, and it's good to be aware of them so that we can adjust our way of thinking, or when we're building out our rating scales, we can do things to address them. Some of the errors include differentiated values, which means choosing how to differentiate or choose between different ordinal values or categories really has a large effect on the responses. There's been further studies done that say that the way we set up our rating scale has a significant effect on what people choose. If we have a rating scale that's a -5 to 5, people are going to choose different scores than if we use a rating scale of 0 to 10. They get different responses. We can also not use the data that we have. We may have perfectly good quantitative measures, but then we take that and we simplify it in order to fit into an ordinal score, and we could lose track of the data that we have. Ambiguous labels don't help the decision maker and can add errors because now we're confused and we don't know which one to choose. Some of the criteria or the way that we describe some of these rating scales are really not enlightening. They don't really accurately describe the situation or our level of uncertainty or the consequences of the effects. So after we've given a score, it doesn't really give us any more information or insight into the risks. Users can treat ordinal scales as a real quantity, which then adds errors. For example, an occurrence rating of 2 doesn't mean that it's twice as bad or twice as much as 1, but sometimes people make that assumption and it leads to errors. Also, multiplying and adding ordinal scores has other unintended consequences. Range compression is when significantly different quantitative values are placed in the same category, and it makes our decision-making harder. Another thing that the critics don't like about traditional FMEA methods is that they're not consistent mathematically, which can then lead to decisions that are ill-considered. Back to Douglas W. Hubbard, who also authored The Failure of Risk Management, it can be shown that mathematically irregular methods may actually lead to dangerously misguided decisions. For example, we shouldn't be adding and multiplying ordinal scales, as is done in many risk assessment methods. When analyzing our ordinal data, it's mathematically valid for us to describe it using mode and median, range, percentile ranges, and even bar charts. It's not valid for us to add, subtract, multiply, divide, or do proportions, or to describe it in mean and standard deviation terms. When it comes to RPN, our risk priority number, which is usually the product of severity, occurrence, and detection, or just multiplying severity and occurrence together, that's not a recommended practice when we're using ordinal scales. When we're using RPN, we shouldn't rely on only RPN to help us prioritize our risks. Let's take a look at an example of an RPN and how we use it to prioritize. If we have an FMEA and we just calculate the RPN, we can see that we have 10 line items that have an RPN of 10. But behind that are different severity, occurrence, and detection ratings that lead to that same number. So different combinations of occurrence, severity, and detection can produce exactly the same value of RPN. Their hidden risk implications may be totally different. If we consider additional line items with an RPN of 9 and 12, we may consider that the RPN with 12 would be a priority, when in real case it may not be. When we only look at RPN, we may be hiding risk implications, which may be totally different and could lead us to a different conclusion. The last thing to note is that RPNs are not continuous, meaning if you were to create every combination of RPN possible, it would range from 1 to 1,000, but there would be gaps and holes within that range. Now you may be thinking, okay, well, what if we just avoid the math altogether and we don't multiply the RPN? We plot the severity and occurrence on a matrix, or plot the severity, occurrence, and detection on a matrix. I introduced this to you already as a risk index and an action priority. Tony Cox has a PhD in risk analysis, and he did a pretty influential study. Dr. Cox studied axioms, or mathematical rules, that risk matrix designers might ideally want their matrices to satisfy. Here's an example of a 5x5 risk matrix that satisfies some of the axioms that Dr. Cox put forth for risk matrices, namely a weak consistency, betweenness, and consistent coloring with a quantitative risk interpretation. Betweenness means that arbitrarily small increases in occurrence and severity shouldn't create discontinuous jumps in risk categorization from green to red. Dr. Cox's matrices also tried to use consistent coloring. There's an equal quantitative risk should ideally have the same qualitative risk rating color, naming green, yellow, or red. And finally, the weak consistency axiom means that the points in the top risk category should represent higher quantitative risks than points in its bottom category. Despite all of those studies and applying those different axioms toward risk matrices, Dr. Cox thinks that risk matrices are not a great thing to use. The meaning of a risk matrix may be far from transparent, despite its simple appearance. Risk matrices do not necessarily support good, for example, better than random, risk management decisions. After Dr. Cox's study, there were other people that continued to study risk matrices and similar risk quantification methods. Others say that there are inconsistencies and arbitrariness embedded in risk matrices, and given these problems, it seems clear to us that risk matrices shouldn't be used for decisions of any consequence. Some equate risk matrices as a simplification of risk, like astrology is a simplification of astronomy. Here's the bottom line. FMEA is not a math problem. It requires people making decisions, people making trade-off decisions, management decisions, and other risk-based decisions. Many of the problems that practitioners have with using things like RPN and risk matrices is that they are the only way that people are evaluating risks from these assessments. Analyzing and evaluating risk is difficult because of all the uncertainty around it. And risk-based decisions require us to understand what it is we know and then being able to make a decision based on that information. We look for ways to simplify these decisions for ourselves by using a color-coded matrix or a cutoff value of a prioritization number. But in doing so and only looking at that to make decisions, we're eliminating too much of the information that went into the risk rating itself. It's like a management dashboard that is oversimplified. There are some management dashboards that use a red light and a green light. Things are good or things are bad. When things are good, nothing's done. When things are bad, then we need to start to do something. But this eliminates a lot of the information that is being gathered and assessed behind the scenes. We're missing trends. We're missing connections between things. And we'll end up being surprised that all of a sudden we're in a crisis mode. FMEA is similar to that type of management metric. If we just use a risk matrix or a number cutoff value, we're basically making ourselves a green light, red light situation, where instead we want to have the information to be able to make decisions. To help us address these criticisms, let's reframe our thinking of risk from point estimates to probabilities. That's the end of the lecture from the FMEA course that I wanted to share with you today. I know some of you out there and listening may not be able to get away from using a risk matrix or using rating scales. They are either ingrained within the company that you're working in or they're part of the quality management system. It may be specified that you have to use them. But I want us to take a lesson from improv, which is the yes and lesson. Yes, we may need to use rating scales and report our results in a risk matrix. And we're going to further analyze our risks with these other methods so that we can fully understand and prioritize what it is we need to do with whatever we're developing. Yes, we're going to use these rating scales that we have to use. And we're going to take a meeting with our cross-functional team that's doing the risk analysis to get alignment and understanding on what these rating scales mean so we can apply them consistently throughout our analysis. Understanding other people's criticisms and the challenges that these other traditional methods introduce to our risk analyses is a great step toward minimizing their effect on our decisions. If you appreciate this lecture and you want to take things to the next step with FMEA, then consider signing up for the FMEA course. It's on Udemy, and it's titled FMEA in Practice, From Plan to Risk-Based Decision Making. There'll be a link to it in the show notes. This has been a production of Dini Enterprises. Thanks for listening.